to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to Safe Inside. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
If you joined us last time, we started our discussion on the history of psychological trauma. We went through, the first couple of world wars and how trauma interventions sort of faded in and out during that time. And as we're coming back to some research finally being given to, the soldiers coming back from wars and all the psychological effects, the beginning of feminism, we're coming back to a time where people are actually starting to pay attention to trauma again. Sandy, you want to kick it off?
Absolutely. I think we got up to 1980 when the American Psychiatric Association actually developed the categories post-traumatic stress disorders.
Yes.
That was the beginning of sort of modern vision of what PTSD might look like. This category was based on the work of Dr. Gardner, if you remember him from our previous episode. And it included all the traumatic symptoms suffered by everything that they've been able to gather around trauma. And so this category of disorders gave rise then, now that we're categorizing it, what do we do with it? How do we treat it? So we tried to figure that out from there on. So this is when, as we've tried to figure out how to treat it, the trying to figure out how to treat it sort of helped give rise to more appreciation for the effects of trauma, because we realized, this isn't so easily fixed. And so we realized it as we were doing this, and it actually gave this better appreciation. There's no single theory or school of thought around every model or intervention, by the way. So I want to be very clear about that as we go along. But do keep in mind that after almost 100 years of research, that whole time, the value of intervening as soon after psychological trauma happened became more and more important. We realized, we moved it to the battlefront. That worked better there. We know now that if there's a school shooting, the faster we can get counselors and therapists into survivors, the better off their outcomes are. So we began to learn that really in the 1980s. And
would you say that I think this is fair to say, and I wonder if you agree, that it has a lot to do with the fact that your body knows that it just has to adapt to whatever it has to adapt to. So if you leave it, your body knows, because your mind and your body, they both have a memory, they both have an awareness of you. They know, okay, this part's not going to change, so we're going to have to make up the difference.
Our bodies absolutely do that. One of the best books that are out right now is by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and it's called The Body Keeps the Score, because our bodies do remember. But if you remember from our previous episodes on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, as our bodies adapt, our bodies are not meant to live in that kind of state all the time. And it has long-lasting impact on our physical being, enough that if you have 6 or more of the ACEs, if you remember, your average lifespan is 20 years shorter than someone who has no ACEs. So our bodies do adapt, and our bodies do miraculously take care of us during that time. But if we don't go in and treat them and take care of the trauma, then our bodies continue to act in this way. And so we have that long-lasting physical effects. Go
ahead. I'll hold my thought.
I was going to say many indigenous peoples, they had ways that actually, whenever something traumatic would happen, they had ways to deal with it that we're actually starting to integrate today, such as bilateral stimulation. So if you were in a Native American group and you would go out and battle and you would come back and you would drum and dance and tell the story, watch and make the narrative and do the bilateral stimulation with the drumming and the dancing. There's a lot of examples within indigenous populations, as well as we're now researching, and it's becoming more accessible, the use of some psychedelics towards how that changes our neural pathways and allows us to accommodate trauma and to integrate it into our lives. Not to get off onto that subject today either.
Right.
But
if we were to give a full dialogue on that topic, I think we'd want to wear kid gloves with it. We definitely don't want to make any like sweeping generalizations on something so potent.
No, we do not. But they had rituals around this. They weren't, of course, taking psychedelics for recreation. There were very strict rituals around it and support. So, but indigenous populations had ways of dealing with, many of them had ways of dealing with trauma or perceived trauma, or perceived types of trauma. So it's interesting to me as we study these things that we're realizing that sometimes indigenous nations have a lot to offer us, by the way. That's a side note, maybe another episode, but
I think that deserves an episode. Yeah. All that I was going to say is an example, and maybe this will segue us into it, is as we're starting to talk about this, it's reminding me of a pretty bad car accident I was in a couple of years ago. And, on the surface, I came out looking okay. But I got right into the chiropractor afterwards, because you've got to do something about that very quickly. Otherwise, it's going to be a longer term thing to try to recover from. So I was seeing my chiropractor 2 times a week for, I don't know, probably 6 weeks, because that whiplash, you may not even feel it the first day or two, but that's going to be a bigger problem for a longer time if you don't do something about it quickly.
Yep. It's the same kind of concept. If we don't set a bone right away, it's going to be much more problematic later on to reset that bone. And we need to really start seeing trauma as a psychological injury. It is an injury that we need to treat. It just won't go away on its own. Just like my broken bone or whiplash doesn't just go away, as much as we wish it would.
Yeah. Well, and the other side of why whiplash might even be a good example is because if all you can recognize is the surface of things, the same as if you'll see in our first episode on this topic, there was a time when there wasn't even space in the social paradigm for it to be an emotionally based issue. Yes. If all you're seeing is, I still have all my parts and none of them are broken, then why would you even acknowledge whiplash?
Right. You're safe now. Why does it matter that you had a problem in the war? You're home now with the world.
You're not.
Well, that rape. Yeah.
What are you
that rape happened
about?
10 years ago. What are you complaining about? You're fine. You're fine.
You're not in a car accident actively right now. You're fine.
You're fine. You're fine. It's all good. And
it's all in your head.
All in your head is exactly what they say. So,
maybe it didn't happen at all.
Right. Or if it did happen, it couldn't have been that bad. Just get up and dust it off. What the heck?
Yeah.
So yeah. And the funny thing is because as we were talking about the history of this and the development of it, we've been talking about adults. As the trauma research continued, by the way, it was in the late 1980s, the late 1980s and early 90s that they started actually recognizing that child sexual abuse they finally put it in the same category as post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1998, so many of you listening to this may have been born by then, by the way, not just me, this old person, but some of you younger people, right? There was a clinical psychologist, Christine Courtois, I think is how you pronounce her name. She authored a book called Healing the Incest Wound. And it was one of the first texts to describe treatment for adult survivors of sexual abuse. Like I mentioned, in the late 1970s, Judith Herman authored a book, which you can still buy, Father-Daughter Incest. And it was one of the first of its kind, and still one of the few that specifically is around father-daughter incest. Very interesting book. If you one of my favorites to recommend to clients that are coming to terms with that particular trauma. They learned that sexual abused children and adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, they showed the same maladaptive functioning as female rape survivors and male combat veterans. Now, those of you listening are probably thinking, well, duh. Except remember that children way back were actually considered different than adults. They didn't feel pain. They'll get over it. They won't remember it. Kids are resilient. They'll just go on about their lives. And outwardly, kids look like they do sometimes.
Which even that, it's interesting trying to reckon with authoritarian discipline styles during a time when people didn't think children felt pain. Because why would you be essentially beating your children if you didn't think they were going to be feeling it anyways?
Well, we are humans and we've never made sense. So we always have a sense of cognitive dissonance going on somewhere in our lives, right? And that is the thing about children. And, rather than recognizing that children are not physically developed, their brains are not developed, doesn't mean that they don't feel pain. It just means that they can't think abstractly and think of long-term consequences and things like that. It's we need to protect our children and be careful with them. And anyway, and then that was another thing. If children are abused, people might say, well, their kids, they'll get over it. At the same time, the kids may be not doing well in school. They may be acting out. They may be all of these things. And instead of it going, well, this is a trauma response, people are going, well, that child is just not a good child. That's a bad child. That's a difficult child. That's a problematic child. It's all of those things, when really the issue was the child was traumatized and still hasn't been treated. And that's something I feel very strongly about. So we'll let that one go for now. But it does feel almost like a duh moment to us when we think about, well, of course these children are struggling with this. As they continue their research, they started studying the effects of trauma with civilian paraprofessionals like police officers, emergency medical techs, paramedics, firefighters. And I know that you all can figure out by now that they all kind of showed the same kind of symptoms after trauma that anybody else showed, right? So they continued to do this research. There were several major disasters in the 1990s. So the American Red Cross started working in the healing process. Like those of you who may remember the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, there was a TWA air disaster the next year. So they started looking at those and the effects of trauma immediately after that. And the American Psychiatric Association came up with another diagnosis called acute stress disorder. And this doesn't hit the major like PTSD criteria, but it happens right after a major incident or a major trauma or a trauma to a person, and they're reacting, but it's still within that time frame where maybe with some intervention, it doesn't go all the way into full-blown PTSD. The military started implementing crisis intervention models and techniques everywhere during the 1990s. And so in 1997, a woman named Dr. Francine Shapiro, she was a clinical psychologist. I say was, she passed away last year or the year before. She developed a form of therapy for overcoming anxiety, stress, and trauma. And it was away from the models and trends at the time, which were basically just dealing with trauma. EMDR was considered a cure for trauma. It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And this form of therapy worked with rapid eye movements to diminish anxiety consistently over time. She brought in a lot of techniques from a lot of different schools of psychotherapy, psychodynamic therapy, cognitive therapy, systems therapy, body-oriented. And what she would do, she would move her finger and have people's eyes move back and forth. She reported tremendous success with this, but she wasn't able to show any clear clinical research data to support these findings. So there are a lot of other particular trauma therapies out there. I use EMDR along with a lot of other ones there. What we're finding today in 2022 is each person presents trauma symptoms a bit differently. And so when trauma happens, it impacts every bit of our bodies and our minds and our psychology, our spirits, everything about us. And so trauma treatment needs to be multifaceted to be effective with people. It needs to be some body oriented or somatic is what we call it today, somatic interventions. EMDR is a good option at some point in the therapy. It's not a complete therapy. Some life skills out of a DBT workbook sometimes can be helpful. Cognitive behavioral therapy. For kids, trauma-focused CBT is a good start if they have a single trauma, a good place to start, things like that. And I think that each year we find out more and more of the effects of trauma and how to intervene with trauma. And I'm hoping that in our children's lives and our grandchildren's life, we'll get to a point where trauma treatment will be an automatic thing that people receive immediately after trauma, and that our trauma treatment will become more and more refined to where we are able to intervene in a way that is more effective, quicker. Because sometimes trauma treatment, especially if a client has long-term developmental trauma, right now we're hoping that as we're looking at the history and the development of trauma treatment through the next major shift, I'm seeing 3 areas that I'm hoping that our field will move into soon. One is by recognizing specific trauma forms, the developmental trauma, stress disorder, so the developmental trauma. And because trauma on a growing child has an impact on their growing neurobiology, which we've talked about in a previous episode. And so the recognizing of that with a different diagnosis would also help spark some research into the intervention specifically around that. So I'm hoping that the American Psychiatric Association in the next iterations of the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, will offer a developmental trauma diagnosis. I'm also hoping that we're moving closer to having a complex post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis that recognizes when you have a multitude of different types of trauma reenacting on your body. So if you were a soldier and you were in Iraq or Afghanistan and you had that PTSD, you come back home and you are raped, and we're adding all of this trauma together, it becomes more complex and it acts on our systems more complexly. And so I would love to see a CPTSD diagnosis and a few other kind of tweaks. To be perfectly honest, I'm hoping that our next iteration, as we're researching that, we will learn that some of these things that we're diagnosing people, we're wrong. For instance, borderline personality disorder, it is definitely my opinion and my experience over 40 years of therapy work that someone who's presenting with BPD has almost always been traumatized, and BPD is a particular set of trauma symptoms, and it should be diagnosed as a trauma disorder. Right now, if someone is diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder, it's almost rises to the level of I don't know, it's cruel because really these people are presenting with trauma. And we tell them, again, that it's a character defect or a personality issue. And nobody wants to work with someone with BPD because they have this reputation of being difficult when really they are just responding to their trauma. So I would love to see that change so that shift around being more trauma informed when we're treating someone who's presenting with those symptoms. I would love to see that happen in the next few years. Yeah. So I'm hoping that
in a lot of subtle shades, I think what we've seen happen throughout our discussion between last episode and this one, and what you just shared about BPD diagnosis, I don't want to, this is a dramatic way to say it, but it almost seems like people want to exterminate what they can't understand. And if not exterminate, then they at least want to detach, socially detach from people whose problems are showing on the surface, thinking, hey, this treating people as if they are a virus that you don't want the rest of society to catch. And the sooner or later, it's going to become a lot clearer that if that's your approach, then you're also teaching yourself that your own problems are not acceptable, and that kind of like just living with an abscess, instead of letting it be drained and start the healing process. It's like,
Yes.
no, if we shut these things away in closets and pretend they aren't really happening, we're going to end up detaching from ourselves and become sicker and sicker. And if it doesn't kill you, it's going to slow you down, and it's going to ruin your quality of life and your relationships.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think it's imperative that we as a culture and as a people start recognizing the amount of trauma throughout our neighbors and our friends and our family and in ourselves, and recognizing that this is not a character defect. It's not something that we should demonize. And I will guarantee that if someone has been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, they're feeling demonized. It is something that we need to work together to treat, to help people overcome. And I agree that we are afraid of things that we can't categorize and that we don't understand. And we do tend to demonize things that we're afraid of. And I think that's what happens with trauma, the trauma responses. Yeah.
And so maybe there's been some need for, on the educational side, maybe there's even some need for kind of helping people to know how to stand in the tension of certain things. Because if all you know, because all you've been taught and prepared for is how to get along when things are easy, then it might be really intimidating to think, oh, my friend has this, and I don't know what I would do if I had to be around somebody who was in a manic episode, for instance.
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of education that's needed for the common person, whether or not they themselves have a diagnosis for one of these disorders.
I agree. And I think that at the core of it, I read a story online yesterday that was a really good analogy of how anybody, even without a lot of education around this area, how that they can help shift their response to someone struggling with trauma. And the story went, you found a dog, and the dog was snarling and biting and snappy. And then you realized that the dog was stuck in a trap and was hurting. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, see how you changed? You're like, oh, right. Remember, yeah, it's not a bad dog. The dog is hurting, and of course it's snappy, and we need to help the dog, right?
Yeah.
It's not what's wrong with the dog, it's what was happening to the dog. If we can do that, if we can shift our mindsets, that's all it takes sometimes to at least get us started down the road. If we can just shift our mindset from what is wrong with that person, and really in our minds, we're thinking, what the hell is wrong with that person? If we can shift it from that to, I wonder what's happened to them. I wonder what's happened to them that's made this response. I wonder what's happened to them that was so hard for them to carry. I wonder what's hurting them. I wonder who has hurt them. If we can shift our mindset to that, it's just the same as with the dog. We wouldn't like a dog that was biting for no reason, but if a dog is hurting and in a trap, we all go, of course that dog is biting. It's hurting, poor little thing.
Now I'm wondering what it would be like to make a multiverse movie version of Old Yeller with like alternate endings.
I know, wouldn't that be great? Because that was pretty traumatizing for an entire generation of people. I know. Well, for boys, because all of us girls, at my age, all of us girls were watching the Disney movies on menstruation, but the boys got to watch Old Yeller, and I'm not sure who was traumatized the most.
Oh,
but there was that, yeah. Yeah, kind of sad on our generation. But we had really great Disney intros. So there was that too, I think. But neither here nor there. Anyway, those of you who are listening, if you want to know what you can do, you can start changing your mindset. Not what's wrong with someone, but what's happened to them, what has hurt them. Yeah.
And if you resonate with any of this, then now might be the time to call up TheraTribe. You could always start with a free consultation call with us before you decide whether to work with us. If this is ringing any bells and you're realizing, ooh, they're talking about me. I'm one of the ones that fit into these difficult categories that have made my life harder to live. It doesn't have to stay that way for you. And if it's clear to you right now, take action on it right now. Give us a call.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. We're going to get into next time a beginning of our discussion on the vagus nerve. There's a lot to talk about on this, so I don't know if that's going to be a two-parter or a whole full-on series, but it's going to be a lot of very interesting stuff to unpack. So join us next time.
See you then.